Okay. Hello everyone. Can everyone like hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. So welcome to today's online webinar where we will explore the topic of Trần Đức Thảo and the origin of French post-colonialism. I am your host, and I am delighted to have you all here today as we delve into an often overlooked chapter of both Vietnamese and global intellectual history. Let me begin with a brief outline of the session. We will first listen to Dr. Dominique Ankoné's presentation in English. During this entire session, you are welcome to send questions for Dr. Ankon through the chat box. I will select several questions to read to our speaker. For convenience, please ask your question in English. Before we begin, I would like to outline a few courtesy rules that we kindly request all participants to follow throughout the webinar. First, please keep your microphone off for the entire duration of the event. If you have any question, type them in the chat box. Anyone who attempts to disrupt the meeting by opening the microphone will be removed from the room. Second, we expect all participants to maintain a respectful and inclusive environment. Please avoid any discriminatory, offensive, or derogatory statement toward any individual or group. Third, to ensure a smooth flow of the webinar, please keep your question concise and focused. This will allow us to engage in a wider range of perspectives and address as many queries as possible. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Dominique Ankoné. Dr. Ankoné is a researcher of political thought, anti-colonial movement, and intellectual history. His recent article on the will to be free in spite of history, Trần Đức Thảo and the activist root of French postcolonialism, set a new light on Trần Đức Thảo activism and philosophical intervention during his year in France. Drawing on the original archival research, Dr. Ankon reconstructs how Trần Đức Thảo developed a distinctly anti-colonialism conception of freedom and addressed directly to the French Republic, the French public, one that both intersect with diverge from the argument of Jean-Paul Sartre. His work often draws an important perspective on the French dimension of post-colonialism and highlights the role of a Vietnamese thinker in shaping a traditional, usually considered European. We are honored to have Dr. Ankoné with us today, and we look forward to the insight that he will bring to this complex and fascinating topic. Dr. Ankoné, you can start now.
Okay, thank you for this very nice introduction. Yeah, I'll be talking today about my paper on the will to be free in spite of history and my ongoing research on this topic. So I wrote the paper a few years ago, and since then I've been working on my dissertation project. I was introduced as Dr. Ankoné, but this is part of my doctorate, but it's not yet finished. So I wanted to point that out. So basically, I'll be talking about how Jean-Luc Thao became involved in anti-colonial organizing and movements while he was living in France. I'll be talking about the impact this activism made on his philosophical ideas. And then in the last section of the presentation, I will talk a little bit about how the two of them together, so his political organizing and his philosophical writings, made a huge impact on French critical thinking in turn. That is a very big topic that I can't address completely. So I decided to focus on some of the discussions that he had with Jean-Paul Sartre, because that allows me to make some points also on some of the more interesting elements of Jean-Luc Thao's thinking. So I wanted to start today by showing you this picture, which I really love. So you see, this picture was taken in the summer of 1937, and you see a young Jean-Luc Thao in his first year of high school in Paris. So he's studying at the Lycée Louis le Grand, which is quite a prestigious high school, where he's studying in preparation for his entry exam for the École Normale Supérieure, which is a higher education institution that exists today still and is still quite prestigious. And what I love about this picture is that, well, you see Jean-Luc Thao right in the middle of the picture. So he's in the second row from the back, and he's looking confidently into the camera. It's quite, I'd say, a handsome young man. He's looking confident. But in spite of all of this, in spite of being in the middle, he is surrounded by a group of these very elite white French men and a few women in the foreground. And I think it is quite relevant to show you this because I think there might have been times in his life that he really hoped that he could become a part of this group and to become a part of French academic life. And even though he made quite a big impact, he never really felt accepted. And it's in the course of his stay in France that he realized this, and this is what brought him to his activism. And he also writes about this in his philosophical text. So in his 1949 text, Existentialism and Material Dialectism, he writes that on decisive moments of his existence, he recognized that his life was conditioned by a certain environment and social structures, and that his life wouldn't make sense outside of them, and that it was his duty to defend these conditions in order to yeah to also keep this meaning in his life. So yeah, obviously he's talking about Vietnam and the struggle for national independence. But what is interesting here is that because he says that he realized this on certain moments, that also points out that on earlier moments he might have thought otherwise, right? So like I said, maybe there was a moment in which he really thought he could sort of become part of the French establishment. Um, but it turned out that it wasn't the case. And I think this ties in with the sort of general trajectory that he makes from phenomenology to Marxism. And even though I don't think he's ever in favor of the imperial regime, but at times he does think he can work within the imperial structures, and he becomes more and more dissatisfied, and he also turns more and more toward Marxism. Um, so one of the things that I wanted to start off with the presentation today is that I think that he came to Marxism actually a little bit earlier than is usually believed. So let's give him the word. He wrote about his why he started writing about Marxism on a few occasions. So, for instance, in a biographical note that was published in 1993, but probably written earlier, he writes that during his life, he was brought to Marxism by a double trajectory, par une double voie. So, on the one hand, through the struggle for national liberation, and on the other hand, also through his philosophical and historical research.
I'm
So
sorry,
from this
sorry.
citation,
Excuse me.
yeah,
Your speaker is covering the slides. So can you put it away?
what is
I don't know.
oh
Yes.
my
Yes.
I guess sorry.
Okay.
So from this citation, I think you can easily get that it is in 1944 when he becomes the leader of a political organization that really marks this moment that he moves to Marxism and anti-colonial activism. Um, but I think it's more complicated than that. And he actually writes on a different occasion that he was introduced to Marxism a lot earlier. So he also writes in another biographical note that he got to know Merleau-Ponty, a well-known French phenomenologist, in 1941 when he was studying at the École Normale Supérieure. And Merleau-Ponty often read fragments from his own dissertation. And in this dissertation, he says that, that his philosophy should end with a synthesis between Husserl, Hegel, and Marx. And Jean-Paul Sartre adds that he was also drawn to Marxism during the war, well, because of the destruction that he witnessed by the Nazis and all the violence and the hope people had that the Soviet Union would win the war against the Nazis. So I think we can really say that it is throughout the war already that Jean-Luc Thal becomes interested in Marxism. Here you see, for instance, this is a document. So he was really quite close to Merleau-Ponty, and he even did an internship with him in 1942. So through Merleau-Ponty, he's probably also already introduced to some of Marxist thinking already at this moment. Then when the war ends in 1945, he's part of this anti-colonial movement, for which he is arrested at a certain moment. I'll come to that later. And from prison, he writes a letter to Pierre Naville, a French Marxist thinker, in which he also says, reflecting on the elections that have just been held in France, that the success of the socialists um, means that France will embark on the new sort of road to reformism. And he adds that the logic of reformism leads to the same disorders and the same disregard for human life that we've just witnessed during the war. So here in 1945, I think he's already positioning himself as a revolutionary Marxist. The question is, what is his political movement then? Is he already in the communist movement? I don't think so, actually, but I'll get to that later. Because it's only a little later that he's really uh, um, uh, uh, yeah, supports the communist movement. And I think it's when he finds out about the Viet Minh, he rallies to the Viet Minh. And in 1947, he writes that to accept the Marxist doctrine, it means to support the Communist Party. So what does that lead to? Well, throughout the war already, Jean-Luc Thal is first he's writing on Husserl. He publishes his dissertation or his master thesis in 1942. And that it does talk about Husserl, but already in a very specific way. And he basically wants to sort of study the coming into being of philosophical systems and ideologies, which is already kind of historicist way of engaging with phenomenology. From 1943 onwards, I think he is more and more drawn into the anti-colonial struggle, and he turns to revolutionary socialism. In 1945, I think from the moment he starts writing his essays, he positions himself as a phenomenological Marxist, and he has a sort of democratic communist political line. And so these are just some remarks in general about his philosophical trajectory that is not always well understood in scientific literature. And let's go into a bit more detail on how he gets into this political movement. So I think a lot of people that are interested in Jean-Luc Thal, they will know that it's at the end of 1944 that he is elected as the political leader of a anti-colonial organization called La Délégation Générale des Indochinois. And it's actually between September and December that this organization is being formed. And you see a very nice picture here on the slide of one of the sessions during the conference. Um, but how does he end up here? And how does a 28, I think, year old philosopher suddenly become the leader of a political movement? Who else is involved in this movement? And who are Jean-Luc Thal's friends within the organization? So these are all things that I've been studying, and that I think are not that well known until now. So it's actually quite hard to answer these questions. And it took me 3 years to find an organizational diagram that lists more or less everybody that is involved in the organization. So here you see a picture of it. I found this in the archives of Charles de Gaulle. So the president of France, which is already interesting to note that the activities of the Délégation Générale worry the French so much that it really is brought up to the president to intervene. Um, so this list gave me 40 names of people that are involved in the organization. I still think this is not complete. So, for instance, you can see here that Jean-Luc Thao is the responsable du comité politique. So he is the leader of the political bureau of the organization. However, we do not get the other members that are part of this political bureau. So I have reason to believe there is more people that are involved, and this is just the official sort of document that they sent to the French government. Um, so particularly, I think the political bureau was made up of Chante Tao, Lei Yan, and Nguyen Can. So it's four of them. I think this because they were all arrested along with Jean-Luc Thao in October when the police started to crack down on this movement. Except for Nguyen Can, actually, he manages to escape and he's never found by police. So somebody must have hidden him. And it's really interesting because Lei Yan, who you see on the right here, he is already a big political figure before the war, and he's working together with a well-known French anti-colonialist called Daniel Guérin. Um, and they represent sort of this revolutionary socialist current in France, and that's why I think Jean-Luc Thao may have initially been close to them. So how does the movement emerge? I won't go into too much detail, but basically during the war, there's two social movements within the Vietnamese community. And both of these social movements form the basis of the emergence of the general delegation after the war. In the first place, there is a movement to help escape the Cong Bin, or the soldier laborers, that are kept in quite nasty labor camps in France. So just like during World War One, France turned to the empire when World War II broke out to bring in additional soldiers and laborers to help in the war effort. As a result, about 25,000 Vietnamese laborers were brought to France, of which I think only 16,500 remain trapped in France during the war. And they are housed in very poor conditions in these ramshackle camps. And a movement in the diaspora emerges to help escape these people from these camps. And just to give you an impression, so the Délégation Générale, they estimated that about 1,050 people died in these camps out of 16,000 that were held. So that is quite a high number. A second movement that emerges is to counteract fascist influence in the Vietnamese diaspora. So there is a so-called Die Doek movement, which means go to Germany. So it is strange to realize that Vietnamese people during the war are in a quite paradoxical, ambiguous position. So even though Nazi ideology is, of course, very racist, because Vichy France collaborates with the Nazi Empire, by extension, Vietnam is also an ally of the Nazis and of the Japanese. And the Nazis and the Japanese actually tried to get people in the Vietnamese diaspora to join their organizations and even the army. For instance, by offering scholarships to students and that are struggling because they used to receive money from their parents in Vietnam. That's not possible during the war. And then a movement emerges to counteract this sort of fascist influence. And I know Jean-Luc Thao is involved in both of these. And so this is how he is drawn into the anti-colonial movement also. Now, how do I know that? Well, the first proof that I have of Jean-Luc Thao's involvement in diaspora organizations is actually this little notice that was published in a French language colonial newspaper, La Patrie Annamite. And it's basically just an announcement of a few students in Paris. That they created a welcoming committee and they invite Vietnamese parents to reach out to them if they are planning to send their children to France to study, because they can help them sort of settle in France. So why is that relevant? Well, because the group that organizes this welcoming committee is actually a group that becomes quite important in La Délégation Générale after the war. So we have Jean-Luc Thảo, we also have Bu Hoi, Le Viet Hong, Pham Can Le, who later changes his name to Chan Dai Nghia. He becomes quite important in the Viet Minh. And we have Hong Xiuan Man, who becomes the president of La Délégation Générale. So here we already have Jean-Luc Thảo with a tiny group of Vietnamese students that will later take on leadership positions in this political movement. But I have also more direct evidence that he is part of these two social movements that are lined out. So this is a letter written by Hong Xiuan Man in April 1940, and it actually announces that that a group of Vietnamese students want to create a new organization to help the laborers here called the ONS, so the ouvriers non spécialisés. So they want to help them because they fear that if the war turns badly for France, that these people will be abandoned and nobody will be there to help them. And they're right. That is exactly what happens, actually. So it talks about a group of students. So who are these people? Well, it's Hong Xiuan Man, it's his cousin Hong Xiuan Ni, Chan Duc Thao, Nguyen Van Toi, Nguyen Quoc Vien, Pham Cam Le again, and Le Viet Hoang. So these are the people that are organizing this organization. They all live at the Indochina House. So this is an institution in Paris where a lot of Vietnamese students live. So it's basically a group of students from this Indochina House that starts this organization, including Chan Duc Thao. So the war does have a huge impact on this group, and they don't come out of the war intact. And Chan Duc Thao also makes new connections, specifically in the context of the anti-fascist movement. So here I have some proof of his engagement in the anti-fascist movement. This is a document from the diasporic Trotskyist group, a Vietnamese Trotskyist in France, and they write that they were doing this anti-fascist campaign, and it's from this time they reckon that they had influence or connections with leftist intellectuals like Chan Duc Thao. So you see his initials here, TTT, then an L and an LV. So LV might be Le Viet Hang, maybe L is Pham Cam Le or Le Hien, I don't know. But Jean Duc Thao is not really in the Trotskyist movement. Instead, I'll come to that later. I think he works with Le Hien and Daniel Guérin together with the Trotskyist movement to counteract this fascist propaganda. And then here, this last bit of proof from an article in the press. Jacques Imbert, I think, actually was also a student in one of the high schools where Jean Duc Thao studied. And Jacques Imbert went to the Amicale des Indochinois, which under the leadership of Hong Xiuan Man moved its address from the original address to the room of the socialist students. There's already another reason to kind of think they are close to the socialist movement. Yeah, and he writes that this group of Vietnamese students, including Thao, they want to break down everything, demolish the colonial empire, its icons, its laws, its institutions, and its people. So here we have April 1944, another clear proof that Jean Duc Thao is really involved in these movements. Well, then the war draws to a close. It's the Trotskyists actually that take the initiative. So they start distributing tracts and pamphlets. Let's say there's a revolutionary period about to happen, and the Vietnamese have to take matters into their own hands, and they have to also boycott the intellectuals that have collaborated with the Nazis. So it's from this sort of movement that they organize an initial meeting. But let me just say, like all of this together brings me to the conclusion that you have a few important groups in the Délégation Générale. You have the Trotskyists, which I listed here above. You have one communist, actually. I don't have time to get into detail about his role, but he's quite important. And I think Jean Duc Thao is also already quite close to him. And then you have this group around Jean Duc Thao that is, I think, close to the revolutionary socialist movement, Hong Xian-man, Nguyen Can, Pham Can Lê, Lê Viet Hung, Lê Huen, and Chan Tay Tao. And most of them, when they learn of the Viet Minh in 1945, they rally to the Viet Minh, except Lê Yen. I think he does not. Um, so, right, the liberation comes. We've had this whole history of social movements already during the war. Yeah, this is the moment that Chan Lik Tower really comes onto the political scene and becomes really an engaged intellectual um, during the campaign of La Délégation Générale. So actually, the organization, yeah, it makes a huge impact, but it is quite short-lived. So in October 1945, there is a crackdown of the French police, and they arrest Chan Duc Thao along with 48 others. The organization is dissolved, though it keeps functioning more or less until December, and then they create a new organization in which Chan Duc Thao also becomes involved again. And this event of these arrests that really triggers widespread protests. So on this slide, you see a notice in the communist newspaper Humanité, which is the best informed one about the arrests. You'll see a picture of a letter from the Délégation Générale calling on the laborers in the camps to start a hunger strike in support of Chan Duc Thao, who is in this prison, right? So here I have a picture of La Santé prison. But there's more happening. Apart from the hunger strikes, there is petitions by Pierre Naville, Sartre, de Beauvoir. Daniel Guérin actually visits the prison. And there are sit-ins in La Sorbonne, the university. And Daniel Guérin, he actually writes in a letter in which he is arranging this visit. So he's the only one who's able to visit them. And that he actually followed the activities of the Vietnamese during the war. And that this combined activity had as a result the complete failure of the German attempts to sort of rally the Vietnamese to their side. So this is why I think Jean-Luc Thal was close to Lê Hien, Daniel Guérin. Apparently, there is this sort of anti-fascist movement going on. Um, uh, um, and yeah, so that explains how Jean-Luc Thal becomes involved in political organizing. But let's talk a little bit about the ideas of them. So what is the political program of the Délégation Générale that Jean-Luc Thal writes? Well, in the first place, he actually aims for an Indo-Chinese republic based on a representative parliament and universal suffrage for men and women. He says that this parliament should decide on whether Vietnam or Indochina would like to have a relationship to France. The members of the delegation are also writing articles in the press under pen names, and it becomes pretty clear from those articles that most of them do not want, or they expect that the parliament will decide independence. But it's important to point out that this is really a united front, right? So you have a group of more radical thinkers with like Jean-Luc Thao, but there's also, I think, a bit more conservative people involved in this organization, which really unifies the diaspora. They also aim for social transformation in the form of land distribution from large landowners, particularly colonists, to ownership of Vietnamese farmers. And importantly, they also say that Cambodia and Laos can leave the Union if they wish to do so. So I think the program is actually quite similar to the first constitution of Vietnam that was accepted in 1946. They have a very clear strategy of the United Front that comes from an analysis of colonial society that is very characteristic for Jean Duc Thao's writings. So basically, they argue that colonialism is a reactionary, conservative force that keeps the colony in a backward economic position. And even though the French might protest and saying that they brought roads and schools, for the Vietnamese, from their experience, they know that all of these things were actually only brought because of a struggle from their side. Um, and I think also importantly, they point out the sort of hypocrisy of the mission civilisatrice, and they consider their revolution as a continuation of a long tradition of revolutionary ideals, but by solving this sort of contradiction between republicanism, democracy, and imperialism. Um, and the upshot of this is that decolonization is in the interest of the whole community, of the entire nation. And therefore, they propose the strategy of the United Front. So I think these ideas are actually quite moderate almost. However, the French society does not really take it very well. So here we see, for instance, a response of Bernard, which was published in Combat, so a former resistance journal, edited, among others, by Albert Camus. And Bernard, he really comes up with a characteristic, sort of patronizing view that is quite common among socialists, unfortunately, at the time. So he says that in a country like Indochina, you cannot just create democracy by a magical spell. And the departure of the French will have no other result than to sort of substitute French exploitation by exploitation of a group of privileged Vietnamese and Cambodians. Um, so hence, bring back the French and let us create the democracy for you. Um, and a similar argument is given by Marius Moutet a few days before he becomes the Minister of Colonies for the second time. And he's a socialist as well. So he writes in the socialist paper that the French have done great services to Indochina. And he acknowledges that the current state of Indochina is not sufficient. But for him, this is not a argument to reject colonialism, but rather it's an argument to do better. So bring back the French and let us really do it better this time. And it's against these kind of theories, I think, that Jean-Luc Thou's first anti-colonial articles are is sort of reflecting or arguing against. And at the same time, I think he also tries to defend this strategy of the United Front or of the Union of Classes. So Jean-Luc Thou writes in his Sur l'Indochine that he wrote in prison, and probably one of those moments that he really realizes that he will never be accepted in France. That for the Vietnamese, yeah, okay, the French may have brought roads, but this is just because they want to drive around in their cars. Yeah, they may have brought some hospitals, but only because they can themselves be, and they can get sick from epidemics, for instance, themselves. But all of this has been paid for with a high price by the Vietnamese worker. Um, Even though for the French, it is something that they brought to Vietnam, something that they gifted. So he says the misunderstanding is radical. It doesn't really, it isn't really about the facts, but it's about the framework in which these facts are placed. So here he really draws on his phenomenological training, I think. And he talks about ideology and the way this sort of shapes our consciousness and the way we understand ideas. So he says that when the Vietnamese talk about freedom or progress, the French hear freedom or progress within the French system. And so they say, yes, of course, freedom, but that means that you need to remain in the French system even by force. And by this sort of mental gymnastics, a colonial war can be presented as as a struggle for freedom and democracy. Um, so Johnny Tao says that yeah, the opposition is really even before sort of the arguments and goes really into the sources of existence, aux sources même de l'existence, that determine prior to the utterance what the words can mean. So I think it's this description of the colonial horizon that will become quite influential, that is taken up by Jean-Paul Sartre and François Fanon, and maybe also Albert Memmi. um, in their writings on the colonial. Uh, um, um, but in the Vietnamese community, it's actually not uncontested. So the Trotskyists actually really critique Jean-Luc Thao. And he says that he's presenting a rose-tinted image, or they say that he's presenting a rose-tinted image of Vietnamese history to justify this union of classes and the United Front strategy. So they say here to condemn colonialism does not need to be accompanied by an effort to really exalt Vietnamese history before the conquest. And they say that it's clear Jean-Luc Thao sort of paints this rose-tinted image of a whole people in struggle because he wants to defend this national union that doesn't exist. And particularly, the Trotskyists have a problem with the Vietnamese bourgeoisie, which they say is a product of the imperial conquest, and because therefore it doesn't have any autonomy and cannot join the struggle against imperialism and the implementation of liberal democracy. So I think they have a point in that sense that you can wonder whether the country that emerges from this will be truly anti-colonial. On the other hand, it's also a bit unfair because Johnny Tao is directing his arguments against these French socialists that are saying that in order for democracy to be there, there needs to be imperialism. And he wants to prove that Vietnamese history has ample proof that the Vietnamese can take matters into their own hands, and that democracy in the first place implies the abolition of the imperial system. Um, so maybe they don't do him justice. I also think he has a point in the fact that feudalism implies political and economic privileges that are connected to the right to exploit land. And he says political privileges in a colonial situation are defined in the basis of whether or not you have citizenship. So in Vietnam, political inequality exists between French citizens and Vietnamese subjects or protégés. Um, so therefore, a democratic revolution should first of all abolish the colonial system. And this is also in the interest of the bourgeoisie. Um, so you might have a point. You might have a point here. Um, on the right, you see a picture of Jean-Luc Tao. Actually, I found this quite recently, so I wanted to include it. So this is on a press conference in February 1946, and I think they are presenting the Constitution of Vietnam here. On the left, you see Hong Xiuan Man, and in the middle, you see another doctor called Lê Thanh Vinh, who is also already involved in the Délégation Générale. So these are really the people that decide to follow the Viet Minh line, whereas the Trotskyists decide to oppose it. Um, so this is a little bit like the context and the political line that Jean-Luc Tao chooses. And I think it also shows very well that his anti-colonial thinking really comes from some of the experiences that he had. And it's really his experience of not being accepted that also realizes him he really needs to take up this struggle. And that brings him into conflict with Sartre. Um, uh, um, yeah, just to wrap this up, so Jean-Luc Tao says the only thing the first stage of the revolution has to do is to suppress the colonial regime. And after the colonial regime, the revolution can be followed by a socialist revolution. Um, so the differences between the communists and the Trotskyists are basically on the struggle, the strategy of the union of classes. They have a lot of similarities too, actually, I think more perhaps. But let's go to Sartre because I think that is maybe a bit more interesting. So we see that Jean-Luc Tao comes through this colonial struggle because of some experiences that he has. Whereas Sartre's philosophy is really known for this insistence that we can choose our own political project and give our own meaning to our lives. So in his famous lecture, later published as Existentialism is a Humanism, he famously says, life is nothing until it is lived, but it is yours to make sense of. And the value of it is nothing else but the sense that you choose. So this is maybe a bit of an exaggeration of his actual philosophy, though. So let's give him a bit more credit, especially in relation to what he says about the past, because this is an important theme in Jean-Luc Thou's philosophy. So he says, liberty is the choice of a future goal in the function of the past. So the past informs your project towards the future. However, the meaning you give to the past is also closely dependent on your present project. So yeah, it's kind of reciprocal with him, right? And in the end, he says that even though you are your past, and therefore your project is more or less informed by your past or the past that you are in his formulations. Nevertheless, you can just say no to parts of your past. No, I don't want to be this person anymore. I'll take a new direction. And Jean-Luc Thal says that is absolutely not possible because in my life, I didn't have the freedom to do anything as I pleased. So he says that existentialists conclude from these reflections on freedom that there is a schism between humans and nature, whereas nature is enslaved by natural laws or completely determined by it. Human beings have a certain freedom to make a choice and to transcend the positivity of the situation. And he says, if you say this, you place the moment of choice outside of the situation. You shouldn't do that because everything takes place within it. And human beings are both natural and historical beings, and natural and historical processes do impact on the choices that we make. So concretely, he said, I do not choose myself as belonging to any nation or member of this or that class, but I was born in a nation and a class. And it's actually this structure that gave my life sense and value. And it exists only within this horizon. So for Chan Tao, it's not about an arbitrary decision to choose whatever you please, but it's about becoming aware of who you are and what your meaning is, and then struggle to fight for this project. And particularly, I think he also has a problem with Sartre's idea because it doesn't really seem to be able to take into account uh, ideologies and historical processes that really impact decisions you make, and that Jean-Luc Thal, I think, feels also impact the support of the working class movement, even for imperialism. So he writes that superstructures or ideologies are also essential for the understanding of history and impact our choices. And even though ideology might arise from a material context, these ideologies maintain themselves. And how do they do that? How do ideologies sort of remain even though the material contexts are gone? And how do they impact us? And how can we sort of fight this pervasive impact? So he writes about ideology coming into being because of a technological revolution, for instance. Uh, um, However, these superstructures have a certain autonomy and survive even though this this material context disappears. And I think you can already relate this, for instance, to the imperial horizon. So even if there is political decolonization, the racism and ideology that was born in the colonial society will probably remain. And this is something I think that Europe is really struggling with at the moment, for instance. Um, but then the question really becomes how do you how do you escape this? Is there a way to escape your givenness? Because yeah, I mean, he even writes that imperialism kind of led the French proletariat to yeah to become close to the bourgeoisie, à s'engager dans une sorte de semi-embourgeoisement, and it rendered them incapable of taking the radical measures necessary to break capitalism. And I think he's referring maybe to the Second World War here, and the fact that the working class movement was not able to prevent this war. And he might be referring to his arrest and the fact that, in spite of the logic that colonialism should be abolished also for the working class movement in France, that he felt the support was lacking at times. And he says that is because of the superstructures and the ideologies that have a certain autonomy remain around us. But his theory of how to transcend this is really complicated. And this will be the last thing, more or less what I'll say. So he has a theory of freedom as becoming, I think, and a revolution by engagement. So freedom is not an arbitrary choice, but it's becoming aware of the meaning that has been passively accumulated in your consciousness. And freedom specifically is the moment in which the I realizes its liberty by affirming the truth that it feels opposing on itself in the passivity of its lived life. So to do him justice, I do think that he would never accept imperialism or exploitation as being a truthful human project, because dehumanizing somebody else can never be a truthful, a meaningful project. But I do wonder, from his account, to what extent can we escape the past? To what extent can we escape the imperialism? And even if we manage to completely abolish imperialist structure, can we really then escape imperialist ideology? So that is a question that I have. I wanted to end by showing you this. So Jean-Luc Thao and Sartre had some debates, even though he influenced him in the rejection of colonialism, I think. Their philosophical differences actually became quite well, it led to a quite angry conflict, and Tao actually sued Sartre because after a number of interviews they had together, Sartre started to say that Jean-Luc Tao was a bad philosopher because the two could really not work it out, and the differences were too great. And this press article says that Jean-Luc Tao actually sued him for 2.5 million francs. Um, and I think this is really a symbol for this reception of his thoughts. So on the one hand, he makes a huge impact, but on the other hand, there is always this distance and this difficulty, and we can wonder whether he was really well understood at the time. And I hope for my project that I will give a more closer understanding of what he's saying than maybe some of his contemporaries at the time had. So um, yeah, that was a little bit of my presentation. I hope I was followed. You could follow me a little bit, and I'm very happy to hear any questions that you had and prepared actually. So I'll stop sharing the screen now because well, then we can do the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, so there are two questions that people are going to ask you. Are you ready to answer?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so number one, I have heard that Trần Đức Thảo is also a phenomenologist. Is his phenomenology related to his anti-colonial theory or his political action in general? And the second question is why is Trần Đức Thảo, with his philosophical and political activity in France, rarely mentioned in the history of post-colonial thought in Europe? Is it because the Eurocentric nature of Western post-colonial thought make it easy to overlook Vietnamese colonial or post-colonial thinker like Trần Đức Thảo? I will put this in the chat box. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for these questions. They're really nice. Um, yeah. There's a relationship between his phenomenology and his anti-colonialism. Like I say that he is a Marxist at base because I think he places colonialism in a Marxist framework. But he does really use his phenomenology to understand colonial ideology and his concept of the imperial or colonial horizon, which sort of prevents French people, even the ones that you can expect to be allies, like the socialist politicians, why this prevents them to really support the Vietnamese independence struggle. And he really draws on his phenomenological training in this concept. And I mean, in general, the relationship is complicated and more intricate than I could say in this presentation, because his reading of phenomenology is also quite specific, and it focuses on the last works of Husserl, and that is already very historical, and quite close to some of the things that we find in Marxism. But in relation to his anti-colonial philosophy, it's really his attention to ideology and consciousness that he takes from his phenomenology. Um, yeah, why is he forgotten? Well, first of all, what is so new about Jean-Luc Thal? Well, I think it is specifically the way in which he combines his phenomenology and his Marxism in his anti-colonial critique that we find later in Sartre's writings and in Fanon's writings. So why is he forgotten then? Well, I think there's a number of reasons for this. So the first and maybe a bit silly reason is maybe he was just a little bit too early. Indeed, in relation to Eurocentric or racist ideas, at the time that he's campaigning, this is really contested. I mean, he's arrested for his activities, and whereas when Frantz Fanon is campaigning in the 50s and 60s, this anti-colonial thinking, partly because of Jean-Luc Thal's efforts, has become sort of a global part of leftist culture. And you really have this third world moment in which many people in the West are sort of really campaigning for independence, and the Vietnamese war also becomes like such a big topic. But this is all before that. So I think that is one of the reasons. I think another reason might be that whereas for some anti-colonial thinkers, there is a strong community in Europe still sort of discussing these theories, whereas with Jean-Luc Thal is not always the case. So his own reputation in Vietnam is ambiguous, or has been ambiguous for a really long time. So that might have played a role. And then I think there's also a last reason, and that is that in this French academic tradition, people don't always cite their sources. So it's really hard to trace his influence because in many of the published books, you only have a very limited amount of references, so you can't even find it very clearly. So that might also contribute to him being sort of left outside. But the interesting thing is that he's never truly outside of debates, right? So post-colonial scholar Robert Young writes that he was reading Jean-Luc Thal during the protests of May 68. He's part of discussions in the 80s. He studied in the zeros, but somehow he never manages to really become so famous. And yeah, maybe it's just the wrong moment, and maybe a little bit his own yeah, the hardships that he faced in his own life. Yeah. Did that
Okay,
answer your questions?
yeah. Okay, thank you so much for the answer. There's another question that I saw in the chat. They said, how did you come across and got interest in the activity of and thoughts of Trần Đức Thảo?
Well, yeah. So I was interested in anti-colonial thinking and activism for a while, and also in this French theory from the second half of the 20th century. So Foucault and Derrida, I read them as well, and postcolonialism. And I've been studying this for my whole bachelor, more or less, and I even studied in Paris. And then during my master, I was reading a book from an American journalist who just interviewed like a bunch of people that were part of these protest movements in Paris and some of these sort of progressive philosophers. And in this book, she cites Jean-Luc Thao um, as as the main anti-colonial voice in the 40s and 50s. And I was just amazed because I'd never heard of him, even though I'd been working on this period for such a long time. So I decided to look up everything I could find from Jean-Luc Thao. Well, I could barely find anything. In fact, it took me months to even locate his writings in Les Temps Modernes. I mean, I could actually borrow Les Temps Modernes in the library, but I had to find out like in which issues his writings were published. And I started reading him, and I was truly impressed because there's such depth and such elegance, I think, in his writings. So that's how I started studying Jean-Luc Thao 6 to 7 years ago. And along the way, I also became more and more interested in Vietnamese history, actually. And because I also like can never understand him without studying Vietnam. And I kept finding more and more. And I wrote my master thesis on Jean-Luc Thao, and then I also managed to get a grant to do this research because I really feel that this early phase in his career in which he actually accomplishes so much, and it really deserves a book in which all these sort of things that are happening are, I think, explained. Um, yeah, so that's how I came across Jean-Luc Thao actually from from a book that I was reading, and not a non-academic book, just a journalist who did some oral histories, I think. Um, and but it turns out in Europe there is people studying him, even in the Netherlands, but it's a really or it used to be quite a small group, but now I think he's becoming more and more well known. Um, I see another question. Shall I continue to that one?
Yeah, thank you so
Um,
much for sharing your experience. So there's another question that can you tell us more on Trần Đức Thảo influence on May 68?
yeah. Um, so in general, I think it is really hard. I've been working on this for a while, and it's really hard to find like direct links because I've been going through pamphlets of 68 movements. Like maybe they talk about him, but they talk more about Ho Chi Minh, to be honest. Um, but there are some connections that I did find. So you have this article of Robert Young. He's studying in Paris at the time, and he claims that he's reading John Tao at the time. Um, and I think that actually makes sense because, well, John Tao, as people may well known, between the late 1950s and the early 60s, he's part of the Non Van Jai Pham affair, and he's not allowed to publish. So he might he might be out of debates a little bit. But from 1968 onwards, actually, he reestablishes some contacts with people in France, or at least I have some letters of him that he wrote to Georges Poudarel, who is a French academic who was also part of the Viet Minh. These letters are from 68 of Georges Poudarel, sort of talking about Jean-Luc Tao. So I think through this sort of way, he probably becomes known again, or like people are like, oh yeah, Johnny Tao. He also publishes some writings in La Pensée, which is a communist journal. And for instance, Chin Van Tao, it's a French He wrote in French, but it's a Vietnamese sociologist who grew. I think he was born in Ho Chi Minh City, but he worked more or less in France. And Jean Van Taal placed a lot of attention to Trần Đức Thảo. And I also found in the archives of the 68 movements that he is a part of it. So I think that is also a connection between Trần Đức Thảo and the 68 movement. Then you have the peace movement. So Trần Đức Thảo is actually one of the sort of first Vietnamese that are that are he's present at the inaugural conference of the Communist Peace Movement in Paris in 1949, I think. And even though he goes to Vietnam, he doesn't really play a role anymore. There is still a Vietnamese sort of group in Paris aligned with this. And they resigned when they heard of Trần Đức Thảo persecution, actually. But I'm pretty sure that they also play a role in the 68 protests. So that's a little bit of what I know so far. Um, uh, I think he was read, but he himself could not take an active part in it much. Um,
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question. Um, that said, how should we understand it when an European comes to explain about Trần Đức Thảo in Vietnam? Isn't it a paradox?
yeah, that is a paradox. And I mean, for me, it is really an honor to talk to you. And I hope I did a good job, actually. But I think there's also a more political point to make about this. So most of my arguments are based on sources in French, kept in French archives. And I think it is kind of a big problem that in order to talk about this part of Trần Đức Thảo life, you need to be able to read French, and you need to be able to study for months in archives in France. And that is probably really hard for people in Vietnam. So I really hope that this research can also lead to better knowledge of this period. Maybe that the sources can be also available here. But I can't just share sources from archives, but I really see it as a goal to make this stuff available in Vietnam as well, so that people here can also study this period in his life. And I mean, it's just too strange for words that first you have a colonial society that is keeping all these documents, and some of these documents are actually like because of he is arrested and the police sees like these documents and then they're in French archives and then now they're kept there. So I think it would be really nice if this could be shared in time. And it might be one of the reasons why I'm explaining this right now. Yeah. Um,
Thank you very much. There's another question. Can you tell us more about his later life work on the origin of consciousness?
yeah, of course, a little bit. I mean, it's not the main focus of my dissertation, although I do think it is very, very interesting. There's a very good book by Jacobo D'Alonso. I think he wrote his dissertation um, on this topic. Um, yeah, so basically, Trần Đức Thảo, apart from this whole political sort of thing that I've talked about, his materialism goes much further. And he also has a materialist understanding of consciousness. Um, so I think what for me was an astounding question was that he says that, okay, if we assume that the world is only natural and there's no God involved, for instance, that's what he says from his Marxist point of view, then that kind of means that matter becomes conscious by itself. And so he literally goes on to this gigantic quest to write a history of the becoming of consciousness, of matter, in which he also writes about the origins of language, in which I think he says that language is a social concept from Marxism that arrives in the context of social cooperation and productivity. Um, and language is not something that is abstract, like in the realm of ideas, but it's part of the brain, and the brain is material. Um, so that is his materialist concept of language. But I mean, there's people that can explain this much better. There's also a Vietnamese guy actually working on this, I think, who is based in London, but I forgot his name. I can look that up because I learned of him only a few weeks ago. Um, yeah, but I really like his works, and sometimes I have the idea that he has this discussion with Sartre that you cannot uh, put this moment of free choice out of the situation because it's part of the human body. And maybe to prove his point, he just goes really deep, and he kind of changes understandings of consciousness and language that today I think are much more closer to science than some of the other works. For instance, you have an Australian neurobiologist who wrote a history of consciousness, Peter Godfrey Smith, which I think is very close to what Jean-Luc Thảo is actually saying. Yeah, but it's not. This is not my expertise, though.
Thank you very much. I see another question in the chat, but this question is a bit too radical for a public meeting, so I just have to radicalize it a bit. So, can you tell us more on how Trần Đức Thảo was accused of being a Trotskyist?
Um, yeah. Um, well, he worked together with the Trotskyist movement in the anti-fascist campaign, and uh, even in scientific literature, he is often portrayed as being first very close to the Trotskyists. But I think it's not true. Um, and For instance, in the scientific literature, sometimes they say Daniel Guérin is a Trotskyist, but he isn't. He's a revolutionary socialist. So there might have been some confusion about that. I mean, what is true is that Jean-Luc Thảo is not initially maybe part of the communist movement, and his communist movement, his communist politics is quite specific, and there's always this attention to human freedom that I think in the non-fungible femme affair, is being contested. Um, but I don't think he is a Trotskyist at all. Um, yeah, I don't think he read much Trotsky, and to be quite honest. But I do think he worked together with them, and that is his communism is a bit peculiar. And yeah, that explains the conflict. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question? Mọi người còn câu hỏi gì nữa không? Mọi người có thể hỏi bằng tiếng Việt xong rồi mình dịch sang tiếng Anh cũng được. Nếu mà như thế mọi người tiện hơn. Let's wait a bit for if anyone else have any question. Okay, so if there's not any question left, you can make your conclusion now. Conclusion of
Me?
the meeting, I guess.
Oh. Should I make a conclusion or?
Yeah, it seems like there's no one else have any
Yeah.
other question.
Well, I am very happy that I could talk to all of you. I hope you found it interesting and that I was clear. I think Trần Đức Thảo is a really, really interesting thinker, and it deserves to be studied. And yeah, I'm glad to share a bit of this knowledge to people in Vietnam, and yeah, I will continue doing so. And I hope I inspire some people to also maybe read some of his works that have been translated to Vietnamese. So in 3 volumes is more or less entire work, not everything, but a lot of it is translated to Vietnamese and published in 3 volumes. So I would really recommend reading them. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, yes.